Have you ever noticed that curious contradiction? How those who speak most fervently about Christian humility often seem to radiate a peculiar sense of moral superiority. It's one of those paradoxes hiding in plain sight, so embedded in religious psychology that we rarely pause to question it. Consider the pattern: the humble believer who subtly judges worldly people, the self-effacing Christian who nevertheless knows exactly who is saved and who isn't, the meek churchgoer who speaks with absolute certainty about divine will. There's something almost suspicious about this correlation between professed humility and experienced superiority. Why would a virtue supposedly centered on self-diminishment so frequently coincide with such pronounced moral judgment? The contradiction extends beyond individual psychology into religious language itself. The meek shall inherit the earth. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. These aren't random spiritual insights, but follow a systematic pattern. Humility is consistently framed not merely as virtue, but as path to ultimate vindication, not simply as moral good, but as strategic positioning for eventual triumph. There's something almost too convenient about this framing, as if humility functions less as genuine self-effacement and more as sophisticated mechanism for transforming present weakness into future dominance. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently Christian humility coincides with moral certainty about others. The humble believer who nevertheless knows exactly who is sinful. The self-effacing Christian who speaks with complete confidence about who deserves divine punishment. The meek disciple who categorizes humanity with remarkable precision. There's something curious about this pattern, as if humility functions not to diminish moral judgment, but simply to disguise it behind mask of virtuous self-effacement. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if Christian humility isn't primarily about spiritual detachment, but about psychological compensation? What if the virtue most celebrated for overcoming pride actually represents pride's most sophisticated disguise? What if humility functions not to eliminate the will to power, but to exercise it through different, more socially acceptable channels, transforming the weakness that cannot dominate directly into moral superiority that dominates indirectly? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Christian psychology, challenging our most basic assumptions about spiritual virtue and moral development. If humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as disguised form of moral domination, how might this distort believers' relationship to themselves, to others, and to the divine? What might become possible if we distinguished between authentic spiritual detachment and the psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious virtue? A philosopher whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological mechanisms by which virtues establish and maintain their power. A thinker who dared to ask whether our most celebrated spiritual qualities might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind Christianity's celebration of humility lurks something much less divine, a sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority, impotence into spiritual privilege, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to question the psychological function of humility? Could it be that entire moral systems have benefited from keeping these functions hidden? What if the ultimate spiritual insight isn't cultivating perfect humility, but recognizing the disguised pride that often motivates it? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about Christian virtue, spiritual development, and religious psychology. They offer a perspective on humility, not as genuine self-effacement, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism, perhaps the most effective disguise pride has ever invented. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in Christian humility that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent, it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between professed self-diminishment and experienced moral superiority, between outward meekness and inward judgment, between verbal self-effacement and psychological self-elevation. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how humility functions not to eliminate pride, but to transform it into more socially acceptable form. Moral superiority disguised as spiritual virtue. Consider how Christian humility typically manifests. The humble believer emphasizes their own sinfulness, yet simultaneously demonstrates remarkable clarity about others' moral failings. The self-effacing Christian speaks of their unworthiness while confidently identifying who belongs to God's chosen and who doesn't. The meek disciple acknowledges their spiritual poverty while displaying surprising certainty about divine judgment. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Humility coincides not with diminished moral judgment, but with its transformation into more subtle, more socially acceptable, more spiritually sanctioned form. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse expressions of Christian spirituality. The specific theological details may change, the cultural expressions may shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Humility transforms the direct pride that cannot be socially expressed into indirect pride that receives social approval, converting the will to power that cannot operate directly into moral superiority that dominates indirectly. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in religious language. Christian teachings consistently frame humility not merely as virtue, but as strategy for ultimate vindication. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The meek shall inherit the earth. The last shall be first. The pattern continues. Humility is presented not simply as moral good, but as path to eventual triumph, not merely as spiritual quality, but as strategic positioning for ultimate victory. This framing suggests function beyond mere virtue, positioning that transforms present weakness into future dominance. The anomaly extends beyond language into social dynamics. Those most celebrated for Christian humility often occupy positions of remarkable moral authority within religious communities, speaking with surprising certainty about divine will, making confident judgments about spiritual matters, displaying remarkable clarity about moral questions. The pattern repeats. Humility coincides not with diminished authority, but with its transformation into more subtle, more spiritually sanctioned form. Moral authority disguised as self-effacement. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss humility, meekness, and self-effacement at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation. How consistently Christian humility functions, not to eliminate the will to power, but to express it through different, more socially acceptable channels. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how perfectly humility serves to transform weakness into moral superiority, impotence into spiritual privilege, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that Christian humility might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What if this celebrated virtue functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as sophisticated mechanism for transforming weakness into moral superiority? What if humility represents not the absence of pride, but its most ingenious disguise? Pride's most effective strategy for maintaining itself while appearing to be its opposite. This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into religious psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether Christianity's most celebrated virtue might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between humility and moral superiority? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if kneeling isn't spiritual virtue, but psychological training for servitude? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. To kneel is not virtue, it is training for servitude. In the spring of 1886, Friedrich Nietzsche published one of his most penetrating works, Beyond Good and Evil. At 42, he was entering the most productive period of his philosophical career, though still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His health was deteriorating. Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days. He lived in near isolation, moving between cheap lodgings across Europe as his meager pension allowed. By conventional standards, Nietzsche's life appeared to be defined by failure and suffering. It was within this context of physical pain and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most disturbing insights about the psychology of Christian virtue. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine religious psychology. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, with both grandfathers also pastors, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of Christian virtue from the inside. He was raised in an environment saturated with talk of humility, meekness, and self-effacement, where these qualities were consistently presented as spiritual ideals. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him to question whether these celebrated virtues might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly acknowledged. What made Nietzsche's perspective on Christian humility especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man who had been immersed in Christian teaching from childhood, yet possessed the rare psychological insight to question its hidden functions. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Might the virtues most celebrated by mainstream society actually represent sophisticated psychological mechanisms serving purposes quite different from their explicit claims? Could the humility, praised by conventional morality, actually disguise a peculiar form of pride, the pride of moral superiority? During his periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that Christian humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority, converting impotence into spiritual privilege, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. Behind the mask of the humble believer, he suggested, often lurks a particular form of pride more insidious precisely because it presents itself as pride's opposite. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis: that Christian humility emerged not primarily from spiritual detachment, but from psychological need, specifically, the need to transform weakness that cannot assert itself directly into moral superiority that dominates indirectly. As he would later write in On the Genealogy of Morals, the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Now, this wasn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project: the transformation of weakness into virtue, impotence into moral superiority, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from anti-religious animus, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of how Christian virtue actually functions in human psychology. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently humility coincides not with diminished moral judgment, but with its transformation into more subtle, more socially acceptable, more spiritually sanctioned form. This wasn't mere coincidence, but revealed something profound about the psychological function of this celebrated virtue, not eliminating pride, but disguising it, not overcoming the will to power, but expressing it through different channels. It was this recognition of the hidden psychological function of Christian humility that gave Nietzsche's moral critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting religious virtue as misguided. He was uncovering what he saw as its hidden psychological purpose: not spiritual detachment, but disguised dominance; not self-effacement, but transformed self-assertion. As he would write in Twilight of the Idols, Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. This wasn't mere theological observation, but recognition that Christian virtues function as integral elements of sophisticated psychological system that transforms weakness into moral superiority through values like humility. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how humility functions psychologically within Christian morality. It wasn't merely a critique of specific virtues, but a profound insight into how religious psychology operates beneath its explicit claims. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of Christian virtue, spiritual development, and religious psychology? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of Christian texts and teachings. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how humility was presented across Christian tradition. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice. The systematic framing of humility not merely as virtue, but as path to ultimate vindication, not simply as moral good, but as strategic positioning for eventual triumph over the proud, powerful, and self-assured. In Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. The noble human being honors himself as one who is powerful, also as one who has power over himself, who knows how to speak and be silent, who delights in being severe and hard with himself, and respects all severity and hardness. By contrast, he observed how Christian morality valorizes different qualities. The salvation of the soul. In plain words, the world revolves around me. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that humility often disguises a particular form of self-centeredness, one that positions the humble believer at the center of cosmic moral drama, transforming outward self-effacement into inward sense of spiritual privilege. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying Christianity's emphasis on humility, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its psychological function, how it systematically transforms weakness into moral superiority, impotence into spiritual privilege, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. Christian humility doesn't simply celebrate self-effacement. It reconfigures the moral landscape to position the humble as ultimately triumphant. The last shall be first, the meek shall inherit the earth. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in how Christian teachings frame the relationship between humility and ultimate outcomes. From the Beatitudes with their promise that the meek shall inherit the earth to parables emphasizing how the humble will be exalted, Christian tradition consistently presents humility not merely as virtue, but as path to eventual victory. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Humility functions as sophisticated mechanism for transforming present weakness into future dominance, current self-effacement into ultimate triumph. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of how humility functions in religious psychology. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he writes, "The slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values." This wasn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition of how values like humility emerge from particular psychological condition, specifically the condition of weakness that cannot assert itself directly and therefore creates moral framework that transforms this weakness into virtue. The pattern continued. Humility emerges not primarily from spiritual detachment, but from psychological need to transform weakness into strength through moral reconfiguration. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how humility manifests in believers' actual psychological experience. He noted how consistently the humble believer maintains sense of moral superiority despite professed self-effacement, judging worldly people with remarkable confidence, categorizing humanity with surprising certainty, speaking about divine will with unexpected authority. The pattern was consistent. Humility coincides not with diminished moral judgment, but with its transformation into more subtle, more socially acceptable, more spiritually sanctioned form. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that Christian humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, Whoever feels that he has suffered the deepest sufferings will also have the right to assert the highest privilege. This isn't mere observation, but recognition that suffering and humility often function psychologically as claims to moral authority, transforming weakness into spiritual privilege through sophisticated moral inversion. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across Christian texts, teachings, and psychological manifestations. The same correlation appears again and again. Humility coincides not with diminished moral authority, but with its transformation into more subtle, more socially acceptable, more spiritually sanctioned form. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how the psychological mechanism of humility emerges from what he called ressentiment, the particular condition of weakness that cannot express power directly and therefore creates values that transform weakness into virtue, impotence into moral superiority, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the psychological function of Christian humility wasn't merely incidental but essential to what he called slave morality, a moral system that emerges from the condition of weakness and operates by transforming impotence into virtue, weakness into moral superiority, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate indirectly. The specific theological details might change across Christian traditions, but the basic psychological pattern remained consistent. Humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as a sophisticated mechanism for converting weakness into different kind of strength, moral authority. On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. The beginning of the slave's revolt in morality occurs when ressentiment itself turns creative and gives birth to values. The ressentiment of those beings who, denied the proper response of action, compensate for it only with imaginary revenge. While every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that virtues like humility emerge from particular psychological condition, specifically, the condition of weakness that cannot express power directly, and therefore creates moral framework that transforms this weakness into different kind of strength. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological mechanism wasn't merely theoretical, but revealed itself in the lived experience of Christian morality. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "It is the profound, suspicious fear of an incurable pessimism that forces whole millennia to bury their teeth in and cling to a religious interpretation of existence. The fear of that instinct which senses that one might get a hold of the truth too soon, before man has become strong enough, hard enough, artist enough." This passage points to his understanding that humility functions not simply as spiritual virtue, but as psychological mechanism for managing the anxiety of weakness, transforming condition that cannot be changed into virtue that can be celebrated. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how Christian morality functions psychologically, not primarily to promote genuine self-effacement, but to transform weakness into different kind of strength through sophisticated moral inversion. By celebrating humility as supreme virtue, Christianity effectively repositions the moral landscape to privilege psychological states naturally available to the weak, while devaluing qualities associated with strength, transforming inability to dominate directly into moral authority to judge those who can. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that Christian humility represents not the absence of will to power, but its most ingenious disguise. As he writes in The Will to Power, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't mere provocation, but recognition that even seemingly self-effacing virtues like humility actually express the fundamental human drive for power, simply through different, more indirect channels. The humble believer hasn't abandoned the will to power, but merely redirected it from external dominance to moral superiority, from physical strength to spiritual authority, from worldly triumph to divine vindication. The pattern became increasingly clear. Christian humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as a sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority. The kneeling believer hasn't truly abandoned pride, but merely disguised it behind a mask of virtue, converting inability to stand tall in worldly terms into moral authority to stand above others in spiritual terms. The meek Christian hasn't truly surrendered the will to power, but merely redirected it from domains where they cannot compete to spiritual battlefield, where weakness itself becomes strength. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological appeal of humility lies precisely in its capacity to transform weakness into virtue without requiring actual change in power relations. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the noble soul has reverence for itself. This isn't mere aristocratic pride, but recognition that authentic self-worth emerges from honest self-affirmation rather than the disguised pride of humility, the moral superiority that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to be below them. What implications might this understanding have for our conception of Christian virtue, spiritual development, and religious psychology? And what might it reveal about the possibility of authentic spiritual detachment beyond the disguised pride of conventional humility? Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion, that Christian humility represents not the absence of pride, but its most sophisticated disguise, pride's most ingenious strategy for maintaining itself, while appearing to be its opposite. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of Christian morality. The psychological mechanism of humility wasn't isolated to particular theological details or specific religious practices, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout the entire moral system. The pattern was clear. Humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but as a sophisticated mechanism for transforming weakness into moral superiority, converting impotence into spiritual privilege, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally, worldly inferiority into cosmic significance. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. Let us be on guard against the dangerous old conceptual fiction that posited a pure, will-less, painless, timeless, knowing subject. These always demand that we should think of an I that is completely unthinkable, an I turned in no particular direction. The more effects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. This passage reveals his recognition that seemingly selfless virtues like humility actually disguise particular perspective, rather than transcending perspective altogether, position that claims universal moral authority precisely by denying its own will to power. The pattern revealed itself in how Christian morality approaches strength and weakness. Rather than simply acknowledging different human capacities, Christian ethics consistently inverts natural valuations, celebrating weakness as spiritually superior, framing power as morally suspect, positioning meekness as divine virtue. The pattern continued. Humility functions as sophisticated moral inversion that transforms natural disadvantage into spiritual advantage through values that privilege states most available to those without direct power. In Christian approaches to judgment and authority, the same pattern appeared. Those most celebrated for humility often display remarkable certainty about moral and spiritual matters, speaking with surprising authority about divine will, making confident judgments about salvation, categorizing humanity with unexpected precision. The pattern persisted. Humility coincides not with diminished moral judgment, but with its transformation into more subtle, more socially acceptable, more spiritually sanctioned form. Moral authority disguised as self-effacement. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in Christian conceptions of ultimate justice. Rather than simply promoting forgiveness, Christian eschatology consistently promises eventual vindication for the humble, final judgment where the last shall be first, cosmic reversal where the meek shall inherit the earth. The pattern repeated. Humility functions not as genuine surrender of the will to power, but as its redirection toward future triumph, not as abandonment of judgment, but as its postponement to divine verdict, where the humble will ultimately be proven right. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian morality. Whether in ethical values, approaches to judgment, or conceptions of ultimate justice, the same psychological mechanism operated. Humility transforms weakness into moral superiority through sophisticated moral inversion that privileges psychological states naturally available to those without direct power. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Verily, I have often laughed at the weaklings who thought themselves good because they had no claws." This isn't mere mockery, but recognition of how Christian morality systematically transforms natural disadvantage into spiritual advantage through values that reposition weakness as virtue. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that Christian humility represents not the absence of the will to power, but its most ingenious disguise. The humble believer hasn't truly abandoned pride, but merely disguised it behind mask of virtue, converting worldly inferiority into cosmic significance, inability to judge directly into moral authority to judge indirectly, powerlessness in present circumstances into claim of ultimate triumph when divine justice is finally revealed. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if Christian humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority? What if kneeling represents not spiritual virtue but psychological training for servitude that simultaneously provides compensation through sense of moral elevation? What if the humility most celebrated by Christian tradition represents not the absence of pride, but its most sophisticated disguise, pride's most effective strategy for maintaining itself while appearing to be its opposite? This recognition wasn't merely academic observation but profound challenge to how we understand Christian virtue, spiritual development, and religious psychology. If humility functions primarily as disguised form of moral superiority rather than genuine self-effacement, what might become possible if we sought authentic spiritual detachment beyond the inverted pride of conventional virtue? What form of self-understanding might emerge if we distinguished between genuine freedom from ego and the sophisticated ego satisfaction of moral superiority disguised as humility? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for our understanding of Christian virtue, spiritual development, and the possibility of authentic detachment beyond the disguised pride of conventional humility? And what might it reveal about the psychology of religious virtue beyond its explicit claims? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic religious criticism into the very heart of how we understand Christian virtue and spiritual development. If humility functions not primarily as genuine self-effacement, but a sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into moral superiority, then addressing this insight requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of how we approach spiritual virtue, not merely revised understanding of humility, but transformed conception of authentic detachment beyond the disguised pride of conventional morality. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of traditional morality, including virtues like humility that transform weakness into moral burden. The lion represents the courage to say no to these imposed moral frameworks, creating space for authentic values to emerge. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for establishing relationship to life beyond the moral inversions of traditional virtue. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond the disguised pride of conventional humility requires not just theological reinterpretation, but fundamental transformation of how we relate to virtue itself. The first profound implication is psychological. If humility often functions as disguised form of moral superiority, authentic spiritual development requires psychological honesty beyond conventional virtue. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't mere self-help slogan, but recognition that genuine self-understanding emerges not from imposed moral frameworks that transform weakness into virtue, but from honest acknowledgement of one's actual nature, not through disguised pride of humility, but through authentic self-affirmation beyond conventional morality. The second implication is spiritual. If Christian humility represents not the absence of the will to power but its most ingenious disguise, authentic spiritual detachment might require a different approach altogether. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, the noble soul has reverence for itself. This isn't mere aristocratic pride, but recognition that genuine self-worth emerges from honest self-affirmation rather than the disguised pride of humility. Not through moral superiority disguised as self-effacement, but through authentic self-understanding beyond the inversions of conventional virtue. The third implication is ethical. If traditional morality operates through sophisticated psychological mechanisms that transform weakness into virtue, authentic ethical development requires values beyond moral inversions. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't crude celebration of domination, but recognition that authentic values might emerge not from moral frameworks that transform weakness into virtue, but from honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies. Not through inverted morality that privileges psychological states available to the weak, but through direct affirmation of life, beyond the resentment that motivates such inversions. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If conventional humility functions primarily as psychological compensation for weakness, authentic spiritual growth might require liberation from the disguised pride of traditional virtue. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I love him who wants to create beyond himself, and thus perishes." This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that authentic spiritual development might emerge beyond the psychological mechanisms of traditional morality, not through virtues that transform weakness into moral superiority, but through honest engagement with life beyond the resentment that motivates such transformations. What does this mean for our understanding of Christian virtue and spiritual development? If humility functions primarily as disguised form of moral superiority rather than genuine self-effacement, what might become possible if we sought authentic spiritual detachment beyond the inverted pride of conventional virtue? What form of self-understanding might emerge if we distinguished between genuine freedom from ego and the sophisticated ego satisfaction of moral superiority disguised as humility? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic spiritual development begins not with more perfect cultivation of conventional virtues, but with psychological honesty beyond the inversions of traditional morality. The liberation from disguised pride of conventional humility might open possibilities for spiritual understanding that neither traditional believers nor critics have fully explored. Possibilities emerging from what Nietzsche saw as authentic self-affirmation beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond specific theological details into what might be called a conspiracy of virtue, a collective cultural agreement to transform weakness into moral superiority through sophisticated psychological mechanisms. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the psychological condition of weakness that cannot express power directly and therefore creates values that transform weakness into virtue, impotence into moral superiority, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of Western morality. What began as direct expression of natural human capacities gradually transformed into a moral system that inverted natural valuations, celebrating weakness as spiritually superior, framing power as morally suspect, positioning meekness as divine virtue. The specific theological details changed across religious history, but the basic psychological mechanism remained consistent. Humility functioned as sophisticated moral inversion that transformed natural disadvantage into spiritual advantage through values that privileged states most available to those without direct power. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the psychological needs of particular human condition. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the master's morality springs from a triumphant affirmation of themselves, while the slave's morality from a denial of a powerful enemy, one who is other than themselves. This denial is a creative act from the beginning. And this isn't mere historical observation, but recognition that moral systems evolve to serve particular psychological needs, especially the need to transform condition that cannot be changed through direct action into virtue that can be celebrated through moral inversion. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different aspects of Western culture. Religious institutions celebrate humility as supreme virtue. Educational systems often perpetuate the psychological patterns established by this moral framework. Therapeutic approaches sometimes reinforce rather than challenge the inversions created by Christian morality. Each domain develops its own language, but the basic psychological mechanism often remains consistent. The transformation of weakness into moral superiority through sophisticated psychological mechanisms that privilege states naturally available to those without direct power. The conspiracy extends into how we conceptualize spiritual development itself, often framing it as increasing cultivation of virtues like humility rather than honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies. It appears in how we approach self-understanding, frequently emphasizing moral self-diminishment over authentic self-affirmation. It emerges in how we understand ethical growth, commonly defining it in terms of traditional virtues rather than values beyond moral inversions. The pattern persists. Spiritual development continues to be framed largely through psychological mechanisms established by traditional morality, even in seemingly secular contexts. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across diverse cultural contexts. As traditional Christian theology loses cultural authority in certain contexts, the same basic psychological mechanism often continues through secular forms. The transformation of weakness into moral superiority without explicit religious language, the disguising of pride behind seemingly selfless virtues, the moral elevation that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to be below them. Different conceptual details, same basic psychological mechanism, the transformation of impotence into virtue through sophisticated moral inversion. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that Christian humility disguises pride, but that this psychological pattern persists even as specific theological content evolves, that behind diverse approaches to virtue often lurks the same basic psychological mechanism, the transformation of weakness into moral superiority through values that invert natural human capacities. The real conspiracy isn't specific theological content, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming impotence into virtue through sophisticated psychological mechanisms that disguise pride behind mask of selflessness. This pattern raises profound questions about spiritual virtue, psychological honesty, and the possibility of authentic self-understanding beyond the inversions of traditional morality. If conventional humility functions primarily as disguised form of moral superiority, what might become possible if we sought authentic spiritual detachment beyond the inverted pride of traditional virtue? What form of self-understanding might emerge if we distinguished between genuine freedom from ego and the sophisticated ego satisfaction of moral superiority disguised as humility? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of authentic spiritual understanding beyond the disguised pride of conventional virtue. Why has the disguised pride of Christian humility remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on Western morality? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in maintaining the appearance that humility represents genuine self-effacement rather than sophisticated form of moral superiority. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific theological details, but the very psychological foundations of Christian virtue, a prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both individuals and institutions built around traditional moral frameworks. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few psychological mechanisms are more useful for those without direct power than the moral inversion that transforms weakness into virtue. By maintaining the appearance that humility represents genuine self-effacement, rather than disguised form of moral superiority, we avoid confronting the disturbing possibility that our most celebrated virtues might emerge from psychological mechanisms quite different from their explicit claims. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the appearance that humility represents genuine spiritual detachment rather than disguised form of moral superiority. Their authority depends fundamentally on their claim to promote authentic virtue rather than sophisticated psychological compensation, to cultivate genuine self-effacement rather than inverted pride that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to be below them. Acknowledging the disguised pride of conventional humility would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific theological details, but the very psychological basis of religious virtue. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the appearance that humility represents genuine self-effacement rather than disguised form of moral superiority. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying humility as genuine spiritual detachment rather than sophisticated psychological mechanism. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present conventional virtue as authentic self-effacement rather than disguised form of moral superiority, as genuine freedom from ego rather than inverted pride that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to be below them. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining the appearance that traditional virtue promotes authentic spiritual development rather than sophisticated psychological compensation. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that humility represents genuine spiritual detachment rather than disguised form of moral superiority. As Nietzsche writes in Human All Too Human, Christianity wants to make men sick. It is good for them to be sick, for only the sick can be good Christians. This insight reveals how moral education might serve not just to transmit specific ethical content, but to maintain the appearance that traditional virtue promotes authentic spiritual development rather than sophisticated psychological compensation, that humility represents genuine self-effacement rather than disguised form of moral superiority. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly Western morality has been shaped by psychological mechanisms that transform weakness into virtue. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of conventional virtue to the more demanding terrain of authentic self-understanding, beyond the inversions of traditional morality. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting moral narratives over disturbing psychological insights, for virtues that transform weakness into moral superiority over honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies, and for spiritual development framed through traditional concepts over authentic self-understanding beyond the inversions of conventional morality. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave. A tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead. But given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound cultural observation. Even as the psychological foundations of traditional virtue become increasingly questionable, Moral systems continue displaying the shadow of these foundations, the conceptual remnants of psychological mechanisms whose actual function remains largely unacknowledged. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic spiritual development beyond the disguised pride of conventional humility? If traditional virtue often functions as sophisticated psychological compensation rather than genuine self-effacement, what might become possible if we sought authentic self-understanding beyond the inversions of conventional morality? What form of spiritual growth might emerge if we distinguished between genuine freedom from ego and the sophisticated ego satisfaction of moral superiority disguised as humility? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of authentic spiritual understanding beyond the disguised pride of conventional virtue, not through rejection of self-effacement, but through honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. The final question isn't whether humility is valuable, but whether conventional humility represents genuine self-effacement or disguised form of moral superiority. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about Christian psychology: how consistently this celebrated virtue functions as a sophisticated mechanism for transforming weakness into moral superiority, impotence into spiritual privilege, inability to dominate directly into power to dominate morally. But it also reveals something even more significant: the possibility of authentic spiritual detachment beyond the disguised pride of conventional virtue, not through rejection of self-effacement, but through honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the overman, not a superior being in the crude biological sense, but a way of approaching life beyond the psychological mechanisms of traditional morality. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. This isn't rejection of spiritual growth, but recognition that authentic self-understanding might emerge beyond the disguised pride of conventional virtue, not through moral superiority disguised as self-effacement, but through honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the inversions of traditional morality. This isn't about embracing egotism or rejecting spiritual detachment, but transforming how we understand these concepts, recognizing that authentic freedom from ego might emerge not through conventional humility, but through honest self-affirmation beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. Perhaps the truly detached person isn't one who claims moral superiority through self-effacement, but one who honestly acknowledges life's fundamental energies without needing either direct dominance or disguised moral elevation, not through virtues that transform weakness into moral superiority, but through authentic self-understanding beyond the psychological mechanisms of traditional morality. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to conventional humility, noticing when it functions not as genuine self-effacement, but as disguised form of moral superiority. It means asking whether your conception of spiritual detachment emerges from honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies, or from psychological mechanisms that transform weakness into virtue. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, "I'm just a humble servant," or "Who am I to judge?" not to express genuine self-effacement, but to claim moral authority precisely by appearing to renounce it. It means developing approach to spiritual growth beyond the disguised pride of conventional virtue, not through rejection of self-effacement, but through honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. It means approaching self-understanding not primarily through moral frameworks that transform weakness into virtue, but through authentic engagement with life beyond the psychological mechanisms of traditional morality. It means recognizing the possibility of genuine freedom from ego that doesn't require either direct dominance or disguised moral elevation. Most importantly, it means understanding that liberation from the disguised pride of conventional humility doesn't require rejection of spiritual detachment, that authentic self-understanding might emerge precisely through honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. This isn't abandonment of spiritual growth, but its transformation, relationship to self and others beyond the psychological mechanisms that transform weakness into moral superiority through sophisticated disguise of pride behind mask of virtue. The path forward isn't about rejecting humility but liberating self-understanding from the disguised pride of conventional virtue. Whether within traditional spiritual frameworks or beyond them, authentic growth requires distinguishing between genuine self-effacement and the sophisticated ego satisfaction of moral superiority disguised as humility, between authentic freedom from ego and the psychological mechanism that transforms weakness into virtue through moral inversion. What might become possible if you distinguished between genuine self-effacement and the disguised pride of conventional humility? What form of spiritual detachment might emerge beyond the psychological mechanisms that transform weakness into moral superiority? What relationship to yourself and others might you discover beyond the inversions of traditional morality? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect cultivation of conventional virtues, but from psychological honesty beyond the inversions of traditional morality. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic spiritual detachment begins precisely where conventional humility ends, with recognition that to kneel is not virtue, it is training for servitude. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that humility lacks value, but that authentic self-effacement emerges beyond the disguised pride of conventional virtue, and that genuine freedom from ego might require honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the resentment that motivates moral inversions. The real journey isn't perfecting conventional humility, but discovering authentic self-understanding beyond the disguised pride of traditional virtue. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating spiritual truth of all is that those who kneel before the cross frequently stand up to step on others, and that genuine freedom from ego emerges not through moral superiority disguised as self-effacement, but through honest acknowledgement of life's fundamental energies beyond the inversions of traditional morality.